Have you ever felt like you grew up in the last quiet childhood before the world became loud? You remember a time when boredom wasn't a problem to solve, but a place you had to sit inside. You had to wait for things, for your favorite song on the radio, for someone to call back, for the family computer to be free. And that waiting did something to your brain. If you grew up in the 1990s, you developed in a psychological bridge era between analog slowness and digital acceleration. And that in-between experience shaped your nervous system in ways you probably never named, but you definitely feel. As a kid, your environment had limits. TV shows ended, stores closed, friends went home and were unreachable. There were edges to your day. Developmental psychology shows that predictable boundaries create safety because the brain can map reality and relax inside it. Your world was smaller, slower, and more contained. So your stress response calibrated to rhythms that included pauses, dead zones, and silence. Then something changed. The internet arrived like a door that never closes. Connection became constant. Information became endless. Comparison became automatic, and you had to adapt while your identity was still forming. Psychologists call this kind of shift a developmental mismatch, when the environment changes faster than your internal operating system. It's like learning to drive in a small town, then being dropped onto a highway at night. You can do it, sure, but your body remembers the shock. There's a concept called cognitive dissonance, the tension that happens when two realities clash. You were raised on a certain promise: things will make sense, life will be stable, work hard, and you'll be fine. Then adolescence and early adulthood introduced a different message. Nothing is guaranteed, everyone is watching, and the rules keep changing. So a lot of 90s kids became adults who look calm, but internally scan for risk. Not because they're dramatic, because they learned early that the ground can shift. You also learned independence in a very specific way. No GPS meant you got lost sometimes. No texting meant you showed up and hoped your friend was home. No read receipts meant you didn't know what people thought until they told you. Researchers studying autonomous coping suggest that kids with moderate freedom build stronger internal problem solving because they can't outsource every decision. You didn't crowdsource your childhood. You tried things. You failed quietly. You adjusted. And honestly, that gives you a kind of resilience that's hard to teach now. But there's another side to that. When you grow up handling problems alone, you sometimes grow into someone who feels weird asking for help. Self-reliance can quietly turn into emotional self-containment. Attachment theory explains how early patterns of comfort and support shape adult closeness. If your generation learned deal with it more than talk about it, you might be great in a crisis and awkward in intimacy. You can be the friend who shows up with solutions but freezes when someone says, "How are you really?" And then there's nostalgia. People mock it like it's childish, but nostalgia isn't just missing old music or old cartoons. Sociologists describe generational identity as being built through shared sensory rituals. The click of a cassette, the weight of a CD case, the smell of a video store, the static crackle of dial-up. Those details grounded life in the body. Today, everything is frictionless. Swipe, tap, stream, delete. Efficient, yes, but the brain evolved for texture, for anticipation, for small delays that let emotion catch up. So, when you miss the 90s, it may not be the decade you miss. It may be the pacing, the boundaries, the permission for life to occasionally go silent. And that tension between silence and stimulation, independence and hidden overwhelm, is right at the core of the psychology of people who grew up in the 1990s. You learned to live without constant validation, no likes, no algorithm deciding if your existence was visible that day. If someone appreciated you, they had to say it out loud, or write it down, or show up physically. That created a slower feedback loop around identity. And slower feedback loops tend to build sturdier self-concepts. But then social media arrived right when you were figuring out who you were. Suddenly, identity became performative. Suddenly, comparison wasn't occasional, it was ambient. Psychologists talk about the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much others are watching and judging us. Your generation didn't grow up fully inside that spotlight. You stepped into it halfway through. So part of you still believes in private growth, and another part feels the pressure to curate everything. That split creates a quiet tension. You value authenticity, but you also know visibility has power. You want depth, but you've been trained for speed. And that tension can feel like low-grade anxiety that never fully switches off. There's also something else. You remember a world before hyperconnectivity, which means you know, in your bones, that constant access isn't necessary for survival. That memory is psychological gold. It gives you perspective. When the world spirals into digital chaos, you have proof that life can function offline. That memory builds resilience. Trauma researchers often explain that resilience isn't the absence of stress, but the presence of internal reference points. The 90s became one of your reference points, a mental snapshot of slower mornings and unrecorded mistakes. But here's the twist. All those traits people sometimes criticize about 90s kids, the skepticism, the guardedness, the nostalgia, they're not flaws. They're adaptations. You are skeptical because you witnessed rapid change. You are independent because you had space to be. You are nostalgic because your nervous system remembers regulation. And maybe the real psychological gift of growing up in the 1990s is this. You understand transition. You've lived through the shift from physical to digital, from private to public, from delayed to instant. And surviving transition builds cognitive flexibility. You can hold contradiction, you can adapt, you can miss the past without being trapped in it. That's not weakness, that's complexity. So if you sometimes feel like you don't fully belong to either world, not completely analog, not fully digital, maybe that's because you're not meant to. Maybe your role is to translate, to remind people that speed isn't the same as depth, that connection isn't the same as exposure. That independence doesn't mean isolation. And maybe growth, real growth, isn't about rejecting where you came from. It's about integrating it, keeping the resilience, softening the armor, letting yourself ask for help without losing strength. Because the goal was never to stay a 90s kid forever. It was to carry the best parts forward. And if any of this feels familiar, stay with me. There's more to uncover.